everyone, and welcome. Welcome to Monday night's session of the 16th Annual Women's Policy Leadership Institute, Rethinking Criminal Justice Reform in Montana. We do have a number of folks still joining us, so I am going to go over some short opening remarks and tech details as we do at the beginning of every WPLI session, and then we will jump in. I'm really excited about tonight's panel. We have three really smart and visionary individuals on the panel tonight, so I think we're going to have a full and exciting discussion. But before I get ahead of myself, again, welcome to WPLI. If you've been joining us throughout the week, you know that we have had 6 days so far of content from Montana Women Vote. Montana Women Vote is a statewide organization of low-income and Indigenous women and families, LGBTQ folks, Black, Indigenous, and other Montanans of color and their allies. We work to engage folks in our democratic processes as informed voters, policy advocates, and community leaders. We're really grateful for the presenters who are going to share tonight and for all of you for joining us. And I'm just going to do a quick overview of some tech details. So tonight's panel is webinar style, which means as you join, you'll be muted automatically. You can ask questions and talk with other participants in either the chat or the Q&A function, which are both found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We really do encourage you to drop questions and comments into the chat and or the Q&A. I will note that if you have a question that you want panelists to answer, it's really helpful to use that Q&A box specifically so that we can track that and make sure we're passing those questions on. But do feel free to use both. We will pay attention to them and we'll leave time at the end to answer questions and have some discussion. We do have captions available tonight. So again, at the bottom of your screen, on the right-hand side, you'll see a button that says CC for closed caption and live transcript. And you can turn that off and on and adjust the size of the captions by clicking on the arrow next to the button. If you have any difficulties with any of this, you can put questions into the chat. You can also call our staff at 406-317-1505. That's our office number. One of our staff will answer it and help talk you through any technical difficulties that you might have. And at the end, we are going to drop a link in the chat to a short online evaluation. You can let us know your thoughts about the panel. These evaluations are important to us. We really do pay attention to them. And as a thank you, if you want, you can enter your name into a raffle to win either a Visa gift card or a signed copy of What We Don't Talk About When We Talk About Fat by our keynote speaker, Aubrey Gordon. It's a fantastic book. So with that, I'll ask my panelists to turn their videos on and we'll get them up on the screen and we will start our workshop. Wonderful. Welcome all. I'm really excited for this conversation and again, really grateful for you all for joining. A little bit about what we're doing here tonight. We've talked at Montana Women Vote and at WPLI for some years now about our current criminal legal system and how it just doesn't work. It doesn't work for survivors of crime, it doesn't work for incarcerated folks, and it doesn't work for the families and loved ones of either survivors or incarcerated folks. What we want to do tonight is start to explore some of the new ways that folks are thinking about safety and about justice, and lift up some creative work, both proactive and defensive work happening across the state. I want to take a minute to introduce our panelists. Amy Sings in the Timber is an advocate and community builder with 15 years of nonprofit leadership experience and more than 20 years of professional commitment to advancing social and racial justice and human rights issues. Over the past 2 decades, Amy has developed and supported access to justice and legal aid programs designed to address disparities in our justice system and promote the rule of law. Amy serves as the executive director of the Montana Innocence Project, a legal aid organization dedicated to freeing innocent and unjustly incarcerated people and the prevention of future wrongful convictions. Welcome, Amy. Courtney Smith. Courtney Smith is the criminal justice lead at the Montana Racial Equity Project. Courtney has experience as a practicing attorney in Arkansas, where she worked for a Black-led law firm primarily in civil rights and discrimination claims. Upon relocating to Bozeman, she continued to advocate for the elimination of racial disparities that exist within our criminal legal system. And she currently serves as a police commissioner for the city of Bozeman. Welcome, Courtney. Courtney, thanks for being here. And Zuri Moreno. Zuri is a community organizer and policy specialist who focuses on racial justice in the criminal justice system. Zuri is a student of abolition and restorative justice and believes these are essential for the building systems of public safety that promote community well-being and health. In 2020, they organized along BIPOC and LGBTQ community members in Missoula to defund the police, and were one of 3 organizers of Let Them Come Home, an initiative demanding the decrease of jail and prison populations due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Welcome, Zuri. So, as you can see, a really all-star panel tonight. Thank you all for being here. And I want to just open it up at the top and ask each of you to take a few minutes to talk a little bit about what justice and safety mean to you and a little bit about your work in these areas. And Amy, if you wouldn't mind jumping in first.
Sure. Thank you, Howell. Appreciate the welcome and the intro. And I'm excited to be here tonight with you and these other amazing folks. So justice and safety to me are 2 sides of the same coin. Justice is in keeping with the rule of law. As you know, in my bio, I talk about the rule of law, and there's just 4 components that are absolutely essential to have justice and safety. Publicly promulgated, equally enforced, independently adjudicated, and consistent with international human rights principles. That's the rule of law. If individuals and communities are to be protected from or unlikely to cause danger, risk, or injury, the rule of law must be intact. And so the Montana Innocence Project works to free the innocent and unjustly incarcerated and advocate for systems of justice that are accurate, accountable, and fair for everyone. We do our work by investigating and litigating claims of actual innocence, but also by assisting in probation and parole hearings for innocent and other unjustly incarcerated individuals. And then, of course, advocating for criminal legal reforms that address not only the causes of wrongful and unjust convictions and incarceration, but also that promote legislation designed to mitigate past harms that have already been caused by this particular system. So on that front, the project took the lead in getting the first monetary exoneree compensation legislation passed in this most recent 2021 session. And we're currently monitoring the very first claim filed underneath the state law. Unfortunately, the governor settled the bill with a sunset provision in the 11th hour of the session. So in addition to championing improvements to the legislation, which we already know there are improvements to be made, we'll be lobbying for its continued existence altogether. Other issue areas that we're laying the groundwork for are Sixth Amendment considerations as they pertain to funding and management of the Montana Office of Public Defender. Legislation for best practices in eyewitness identification by law enforcement, practices of the Montana Board of Pardons and Parole under the scrutiny of due process considerations, which is not something that currently exists, and support for the study of criminal legal system data in Montana, specifically as it pertains to transparency in law enforcement officer disciplinary records. So that's just the kind of big picture overview of what we do and what we've currently got cooking on the legislative front.
Amazing. It's quite a lot that you have cooking. Thanks, Amy. Courtney, how about you?
Thank you, Hal, for introducing me. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about how I came to the Montana Racial Equity Project. So I'm fairly new to the state, and I visited several times before I decided to move here. But out of curiosity, I went to the census data and said, I know that Montana is a majority white state, but let's look at what the numbers actually show. And me being Black, I went and saw 0.6%. And that number terrified me a little bit, that less than 1% of the population in the state of Montana is Black. And so having a civil rights background, I also wanted to look into, are there any organizations uplifting people of color? Is there anything that exists? And so I went to Google and up popped the Montana Racial Equity Project. So for me, moving here felt a little bit safer, a little bit easier, because I knew that this organization existed. And when I think about safety, I think about community, and being able to feel that I can exist here safely involves being able to uplift other people of color when things happen, being able to feel that I am safe and protected and that others are looking out for me. If something happens to me, when you're a person of color who's marginalized, who lives in a minority status, who might experience disabilities, LGBTQ, or any of the intersection of those things. And so what's been most important to me in this work through the Montana Racial Equity Project is when people reach out and they have stories about being discriminated against, that they don't feel gaslit, that they're not told that their stories aren't real, that that's not happening to them, and that they have a safe place where they can be heard. So right now, a lot of what my program area has focused on is being a way to connect people who might feel that they don't have anyone to talk to, either to legal representation, providing information through the Human Rights Bureau, or even encouraging people who are incarcerated, who've exhausted their legal remedies, to reach out to the Montana Innocence Project, encouraging people who want to protest to reach out to folks like Zuri, organizers in the community, so that they know that they have a safe place to land. So when I think about safety, I think about ensuring that people know my story, know other stories, and can actually hear folks who are different and know what it means to be different in a state like Montana. So thank you.
Thank you for that, Courtney. Zuri, take it away.
Evening, everyone. Again, thanks, Howell, for the intro. And I'm just so much appreciating being able to sit on a panel with these two amazing individuals. I will give a little bit of a background one-liner that I grew up in a really strict, like eye for an eye family when it came to both punishment in my family and also like looking outwardly into the world. And so it's been a real journey for me intellectually and spiritually to get to a place where I'm looking out and seeing justice as a system that elevates and prioritizes healing, that justice is the interruption of the perpetuation of harm. This is a type of justice that's a holistic and complex approach. I'm not going to come in here and be like, healing and restoration and transformative justice, it's going to be easy, because it's not. So much of our systems tell us otherwise. Through those current systems, we're told to compartmentalize a certain crime or situation, pass judgment on that snapshot, and hand out a punitive, disjointed response. And so much of that is based in white supremacy and the colonial system of how we judge individuals who aren't, like, don't belong to the majority. I use that word cautiously. And this is a super disjointed response. Like, it's not taking into account the history of that person or the community, or even taking into account the systems in which this person is interacting in. So that's justice, right? It's not locking someone in a cage. It's for years or forever to end their lives. It's really figuring out, how do we interrupt harm, and how do we bring healing into a community, not just for the survivors, also for the person who committed the crime. So safety really is having the resources necessary to live our lives. I can get kind of like 30,000 feet with safety, but it really means affordable healthcare, food, stable and affordable housing, education, space to live freely as our authentic selves, stable access to income. And I really want to note that stable access to income doesn't mean employment. It could, but it doesn't have to. I'm a real firm believer that we shouldn't have to work to be able to survive. And, this also includes, I think that this is kind of my notes. I'm looking at my notes, sorry, y'all. The work that I'm doing sometimes is reactive and sometimes it's proactive. It really depends on what's happening in our communities and across the state. I wish I could be doing more proactive work. I really want to be increasing the funding and access to mental health and substance use in our state. I love when my path intersects with Amy and Courtney, and I get to work on the proactive things that you all are working on. Some of that includes defunding police budgets and reallocating those funds within our current, local and statewide budgets. It's crisis response teams, and it's independent accountability for oversight on the police and judges. It's community-centered public safety. And also, so much of the work that I do is, like I said, reactive. It's to bringing awareness to when police brutality happens. It's reminding folks that there are other ways that we can do this, that people who are currently incarcerated or formerly incarcerated actually do have human rights and shouldn't be stripped of those human rights because of a conviction. And I will just end with saying that I want to emphasize I am a student of abolition, so I am still learning and unlearning so much of what I grew up in these punitive systems. And something that really helps me in thinking about abolition is, this is from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, abolition is about abolishing the conditions under which prison became the solution to problems, rather than abolishing the buildings we call prisons.
Thanks, Zuri. I love that. And you're quoting one of my favorite abolitionists. So thank you for that as well. And we're actually going to stick with you for a minute, Zuri, and we're going to shift a little bit from some of the big picture framework to talking a little bit about policy. Zuri, you've lobbied for a couple sessions now on criminal legal reform issues at the legislative level and at the local level. Can you tell us a little bit about the trends that you're seeing, either positive or negative, in the policy arena?
Absolutely. And I invite either I'm Amy or Courtney to interrupt if you think of anything. I like to start with the bad news first. And I'll just try not to highlight too much of it. At the local level, we saw in 2022 these outcries for defunding the police. And unfortunately, we saw in both parties the knee-jerk reaction to defend the police, speak up for their jobs as heroics, and protect both their funding and power within the community. Two places that I saw a lot of active participation and bringing awareness to the negative impacts of police with the community were in Missoula and Helena. And, the movement of organizers in those two places, I think, really raised awareness and was eye-opening to how much people really wanted to defend the status quo of having police in schools or having police doing crisis response. I'm also seeing the continued movement to stigmatize and villainize those who struggle with substance use. And this is both at a local and statewide level. I saw this last session increased mandatory minimum prison sentences, revoking access to treatment when the person who is being charged has 3 or more substance related charges. They are sent instead. They don't get access to treatment first, they just get sent to incarceration first. And then they'll get access to treatment after a certain amount of time in prison. And what's most concerning about this rhetoric is that lawmakers use is really talking about what they think people deserve when they talk about access to mental health and substance use services. And we don't have a lot of great options in Montana. I also I really, really appreciated what Amy said around the public defender's office. That service is protected in our Constitution. And yet this past session, legislators really whittled down the budget to an unworkable amount. And that was quickly realized after the session left. And legislators knew that. They heard from the public defender's office on that, and unfortunately still continued. So that's the bad news. In a summary. And I think that the good news is there are more and more people talking about this. There are more and more people showing up to the Capitol to talk about why individuals deserve compensation for wrongful conviction. There are more and more people talking about, well, wait, yeah, maybe this person went to treatment, but was it adequate treatment? Was it what they needed? What could we be providing? Instead of housing someone in a prison at $108 a day or however much it is, I think it's around that. What if we actually paid for treatment for $30 to $50 a day? And it's just really brings me a lot of hope that more and more people are talking about it, and more people are questioning what they've been taught around punitive systems. And one great thing that we saw here in Missoula was, in 2020, they passed this 10-month trial period for the crisis response team. Currently, we're having some issues around that, but I'm going to remain hopeful that got here and we have something we can use. And then in Missoula, we just elected 3 new judges that ran on a platform of criminal justice reform. And that's amazing. And we saw so many people involved in voting for judges that normally I think that because it's a down ballot vote, that people just don't pay attention.
Courtney or Amy, anything you want to add? I know you've got your own questions coming up, but jump in.
I just so appreciate the ending with the hopefulness around the increased visibility and dialogue. I feel like that really is the, a lot of times, especially when you go through a session like this last, you need to look for something to buoy you. And I really do feel like the hard conversations are starting to gain some traction, and that the engagement, particularly the engagement that I've seen from younger people, is so incredibly encouraging, and I'm really hopeful that is going to continue, that momentum is going to continue.
Absolutely. I agree. Courtney, let's move to you. You already talked about this a little bit. And of course, Montana Racial Equity Project is a racial justice organization. And, you highlighted your experience at the intersection of racial justice and criminal legal reform. And we know that the two are inextricably tied. Can you talk to us a little bit about what parts of those intersections you're focusing on right now?
Yeah, sure. So as we know, the criminal legal system, there are racial disparities in every part of it. Incarceration rates, sentencing, even the death penalty. But a lot of those disparities start with policing at the point of contact with law enforcement. So that's a lot of what the Montana Racial Equity Project has been focusing on over the last year. Bringing awareness to incidents that start between BIPOC and law enforcement officers. It's, like Zuri pointed out, very hard to overcome when the narrative has always been about protecting and serving and how great police officers are and all the good things they do, which is true. There are some good things that can be done by police officers in community, but it's hard to overcome a narrative about how police officers are always correct, or always in the right, or always good, when we know that there are racial disparities in arrests. So for example, last year I got in contact with Coleman Stump's family. He was a Native American man who was killed in Billings, Montana in 2020. And his family really tried to raise awareness around what happened in his death, along with some other organizations. But they were kind of regularly ignored by by law enforcement and state agencies, especially because of the limitations on the release of public information under Montana's confidential criminal justice information statute. And so last Monday, when his coroner's inquest came up, which is used to determine the cause of death and whether criminal charges are going to be brought against an officer who kills someone while on duty, I attended, and it was pretty appalling to see how that type of system operates, where a lot of coded language was used during the hearing about how certain people are threatening in certain neighborhoods you don't want to go into. And so a lot of the Montana Racial Equity Project's work has been on raising awareness about how even something that might seem neutral can be racially coded in a way that discriminates against people of color in certain aspects. So yeah, I won't talk too much or go into too much detail about it, but it's kind of unfortunate that we have such a bias and one-sided conclusion in determining the cause of death, like the coroner's inquest. And in Billings, since 2012, no police officer has ever been found not justified in a police shooting as a result of that. MTREP also raised awareness around school resource officers, like you said, and the ways in which their involvement in schools can lead to exclusion of a lot of marginalized students who are disproportionately suspended, expelled, criminalized, and lose a lot of days. Anecdotally, I talked to some teachers locally who said that It usually starts in middle school, and if students are criminalized, then the odds of them graduating drop substantially. And so making sure that people are aware of criminal legal issues that disproportionately impact BIPOC people that are often overlooked and ignored in Montana, unfortunately, for a lot of reasons. But that has been a big part of what MSHREP has been focusing on as a racial justice organization, kind of at the intersections.
Thank you for that, Courtney. Amy, you talked a little bit about your work at the Innocence Project, focusing on addressing wrongful convictions. At least that's part of your work. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've learned about how wrongful convictions happen and what sort of systemic changes need to be made to stop them from happening?
Sure, thanks. Well, let's see here. So the Innocence Project's policy priorities reflects the lessons that the project has learned. And when I say the Innocence Project, I mean the Innocence Project writ large. The original project is based in New York, and now there's a network of Innocence Projects that is somewhere in the range of 65 internationally. We're all very different in a lot of ways, but we all focus primarily on innocence work. And the lessons that have come out of really DNA exonerations initially, which have, even though now we're sort of moving away from DNA exonerations, or not away from them, but we are really trying to move beyond in a lot of ways. But those core things that we learned from those exonerations are at the kind of heart of the policy work that addresses each of the contributors of wrongful convictions. Some of the things that have been illuminated by that early work are official misconduct, predominantly in the what we've seen in exonerations predominantly has been Brady material, or the concealing of exculpatory evidence. 55% overall of exonerations involved some form of official misconduct by either mostly police or prosecutors. And to speak to the racial justice piece of innocence work and what we're really talking about here, how things are stacked, 55% overall involves some form of official misconduct. 70% of Black exonerations involved some form of official misconduct. There's disparities all across the board. And I'll talk, touch on just a few of those as I go through. Eyewitness misidentification is it's the number one cause that we see. We see it in 69% of exonerations involve some form of eyewitness misidentification. And even though we know this, and we over and over again see different best practices that are put into place and then wiped aside, or voluntary compliance like Montana has, as opposed to actually having a legislation on the books that guides how eyewitness identifications are carried out. It continues to happen. Misapplication of forensic science, or the use of junk science altogether, is a significant factor. False confessions. Here, 18% of exonerations with registered with the National Registry. And this, talking about the disparities, that number jumps to 65% false confessions for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. I mean, it's it's significant. And when you think about what all plays into that, I mean, false confessions have a laundry list of reasons why somebody might confess to a crime that they are innocent of. But fear is a big one, knowing how you are perceived and will be treated in this carceral system, in this system that sets BIPOC folks up really to be behind bars. Massive disparity. Unreliable jailhouse informants. That testimony has been documented in 21% of death row exonerations. And inadequate defense, or basically you have a public defender who, for whatever reason, is not able to provide you with, or did not provide you with, the kind of defense that really would have resulted in a fair trial. In addition to the factors that I mentioned above, the Innocence Project promotes laws that ensure robust access to post-conviction DNA testing and evidence retention, as well as the legal mechanisms for the wrongfully convicted to achieve relief based on new non-DNA evidence of innocence. As I mentioned before, DNA was really where the project kind of got its roots, but now moving beyond and looking to reforms that allow for relief based on non-DNA evidence. And Montana, Cody Marble's case here was one of the first. It was the first in Montana, and it's one of the early cases that has allowed for some of these reforms to take shape.
So I'm going to kick it open to all of you, and this is just building on what you've been saying, but thinking about survivors of crime. And we hear survivors of crime, and especially women or people who aren't men, used to justify increased policing and incarceration. This is a trope that has been part of incarceral history for 100 years in this country, or longer, really. In your experience, what do survivors really need to move towards safety and justice? And any of you can jump in, and I'll call on names if I have to, but let's kick it open and make this conversation style.
I will jump in and quickly say that I think it was Courtney that was talking about gaslighting, and we as a community deserve a criminal justice system that doesn't gaslight us. I think that so many times survivors are used in, as a look at this survivor, poor survivor, here, increase all these penalties, increase our funding for prisons and jails and mandatory minimums and all of these pieces to villainize the individuals who are engaging in the crime, and it isn't actually ending the perpetuation of harm. And yes, there are some services that are given to survivors, and in my opinion, they are not adequate. That is where we should be investing, is in the healing of survivors and the healing of communities where crime has happened, and also going to the foundation of what was going on with this crime. And that's deeper than the criminal justice system, right? That is our whole system. That is our white supremacist system. That is our patriarchal system. That is our homophobic and transphobic system that so much of our structures are built on, and so much of our criminal code is built on. But I will say that increased penalties and policing don't correlate to actually making women, people of color, queer people, trans people, folks living with disabilities, and other marginalized communities safer. We're actually the ones who are over-policed, and we're the ones who are over-incarcerated.
Yeah, I appreciate you, Zuri, for that perspective. I happen to also be a survivor of violent crime, and I won't go into anything too graphic in talking about that. But what struck me about being labeled a victim witness was kind of the way that everything is so impersonal. You have this horrible thing happen, you go through a photo lineup. I didn't hear from any investigating agency for about a year and a half. And then I was called to testify, be re-traumatized in front of a group of strangers, including 12 jurors. And then I was kind of dismissed, and that was the end of my process, aside from being able to submit a victim witness impact statement, which I'm not really sure how much good that did. And that was the extent of my involvement in so-called justice. But what I really could have used was answers, and an adversarial system isn't really set up to have those type of conversations. You have someone who's facing the loss of their freedom and their life. So it's understandable that they're not going to ever participate with someone when you have that type of system set up that way. So I guess speaking from my own personal experience, I would say that people and victims need justice, which doesn't feel like someone sitting behind bars for decades at a time. It feels like transparency. It feels like honesty. It feels like accountability, apologies, being able to talk about the harm and how to move forward and actually have solutions that work and ways in which people can overcome what has happened. Steps to repair the harm if possible, which isn't always possible, but San Quentin Prison has done really great work around victim offender dialogues and promoting the repair for the harm that's happened. And I think in order for victims to feel safe, they need to be able to actually have that accountability and to look deeper. Having more police officers on the streets doesn't really do anything. And we know that broken windows policing doesn't work to increase public safety. So working towards more just and humanizing systems and processes are really what victims need.
I feel like Zuri and Courtney are in a better position to speak to some of these particulars, but what I will say is that the work of the project, we also focused on death penalty abolition, death penalty from an innocence work perspective, really just allows the possibility that we would execute innocent people. We know it has happened, and we know that we can't even imagine the extent. But in that abolition advocacy, I've experienced there's this idea, there's this promotion that the death penalty provides some sort of healing or some sort of closure for families, for individuals. And what I have heard from those families is that it does not. And, I've experienced a similar sentiment in accompanying individuals in their parole hearings, where you have family members who, or sometimes individuals themselves who have expressed that it actually continues, it perpetuates the harm. And what they're looking for is not life sentences, death sentences. It's not any of that. It really is the ability to hear from someone that they have recognized the harm that they've done, and to move on and to know that they might have a chance at having an actual life and being a part of a community again, so that the loss doesn't continue to be compounded in a lot of ways. We also work with a reentry organization, and in talking with some ex-offenders, some folks who have said, yes, this is a crime I've done, not innocence work, but that's the number one thing that they have said they've felt barriers to by the particular system that's in place right now, the carceral system and the adversarial system that our legal constructs have really put forth, that there is no room for that healing on either, the accountability and the healing on either side of things. So that's what I would offer on this particular question.
Thank you. It feels a lot like one of the things that I've heard all of you allude to or say directly is that our current system really centers the idea of crime, and certainly the idea of punishment, and folks who are survivors of crime in any capacity don't find a place for themselves in that system. And I think that's really connected to our general understanding of support and investment in communities as unrelated to public safety and justice. So I think that, being able to access housing and healthcare and income, those are, for me, a way that we would center people who experience harm. But we often talk about these conversations really separately. And I think both in terms of big picture visionary abolition thinking and day-to-day policy work, that's a real challenge. Amy, we did have one question come up in the Q&A that I'll have you answer briefly. Is the Innocence Project able to look into cases more than 10 plus years old?
Yes. So different the Montana Innocence Project does. Different innocence projects set different guidelines for, what cases they'll take and length of sentences as to whether or not they will take them on, but the Montana Innocence Project does.
Thank you for that. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about policy work, and we're obviously limited in this particular moment in Montana in our policy work by the political landscape, which is challenging to say the least. But setting aside those limits, for each of you, what's one sort of visionary or aspirational policy change that you'd like to see, and why? Courtney, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. I would say ending qualified immunity is a huge one that I would want for us to be able to tackle. Qualified immunity is a judicially created legal defense used by state actors, including police and prosecutors, to limit civil rights liability, with some exceptions. And if police officers were held accountable, then maybe they would think twice before perpetuating the same type of violence against citizens. Yeah, so that's a big one that I would like to promote. I know not too long ago, I'll bring this up just because it's funny. Well, no, not funny, but kind of fun. In September 2021, there was a woman in Bozeman who was assaulted by police officers, and that was captured on video. And so luckily, because of it being captured on video and circulating widely, they actually looked into it themselves. As an aside, if you want to be a good ally, please take out your phone and record the police interactions that you might see. It could help somebody save a life. Anywho, the police office, the Bozeman Police Department took a couple of months and found themselves justified in punching this woman in the face, but said that it wasn't ideal. And so just as a local anecdotal example of how police officers policing themselves doesn't really work, and how having some form of accountability, civil liability could help a lot of people in a lot of ways. And so I know that in the last legislative session, there were attempts to end qualified immunity. Colorado has been able to create a civil action for deprivation of rights under their constitution. And victims can sue officers for failing to intervene to stop other officers who engage in civil rights violations as well. And specifically, they laid out that qualified immunity is not a defense to liability. So hopefully there's something that can get out of committee here in Montana that deals with ending qualified immunity here.
That's such a good answer. And, you can see from the chat that everybody thinks that's such a good answer. Do you know off the top of your head, Courtney, other than the sort of civil avenue for redress in Colorado, are there other states or municipalities that have been able to successfully end or limit qualified immunity?
I'm not 100% sure. I think there was this, I don't want to give the wrong information. Vermont or Maine, there was another state recently that was able to do something like that. Do you, Amy or Zuri, know?
I know that New Mexico, just in its last legislative session, took a toe in. There's some caps on the kinds of remedies, and California, I believe, is in the midst of, or has already went forward. Washington State is in the process of pursuing, so there's some traction.
Yeah, the George Floyd Policing Act was supposed to have some, qualified immunity language in it. If they can ever bring that to a vote, that would be nice too, at the national level.
Fantastic. Amy, what about you? What's one aspirational policy change you're excited about?
Yeah, so I would really love to see more I guess progressive prosecution is what I would call it. I want to see incarceration as like the last resort, really across the board, taking a look at the kinds of things that we lock people up for. And it speaks to many of the things that Zuri and Courtney and you have talked about when we're looking at food insecurity, housing insecurity, mental health, and really locking people up for behavioral needs, and not taking a look at the dignity and the destruction that is coming about to not only individuals, but their families and their communities and society as a whole. That could really be addressed in a large part by taking a look at what we are locking people up for, and making sure that it is the absolute minimal of crimes that are classified as a need for incarceration, and certainly taking a look at sentencing, mandatory minimums, and a whole host of terrible law and order policy.
Thank you. Agreed. Absolutely. Zuri, what about you? What do you have to add?
I will quickly tell everyone that I'm notorious for not being able to make decisions. So when you tell me to choose one policy, I make a list of 6 and I'm like, is this one? You're welcome. So I will be quick and I'll start with what I think is the most feasible, which is funding crisis response teams and centers across the state. You know, when someone is in crisis, the only service most communities have is to call the police. And the only thing that police are adequately trained to do is decide whether or not someone's breaking the law or looks suspicious. And they oftentimes respond with violence when someone is in crisis, because they are not trained to adequately respond to crisis. And oftentimes, just depressingly, heartbreakingly, this means that the person who's in crisis is harmed or killed. At the best case scenario, they are arrested and placed in jail or detained. So we need crisis response across our state. We absolutely do. And now I'll just quickly go through all of my policy dreams, which include separating the coroner's office from the sheriff's office. Don't get me started on that. We need to end the practice of shackling pregnant prisoners while they're giving birth. We need to end solitary confinement. And my biggest dream is what Amy already said, which is removing the majority of people from jails and prisons, making sure they don't go there in the first place, and then creating structures to humanely and compassionately house individuals who are at risk to themselves and others, making sure that they have access to care and they have access to the things that they need, because at the end of the day, people who are in our jails and prisons are just that. They are people, and committing a crime does not remove any of our basic human rights. Now I'm off of my soapbox.
Well, this is a great list. So I want to ask each of you to talk a little bit about how folks can find out more about the work that you do and the issues that you work on. If there are folks who are eager for resources, to be told what email list to sign up for, where they might volunteer. And, you know, it's an opportunity for you specifically if you have a pitch for your organization or, you know, effort that you're involved in. I will also say that we have lots of time at the end here for questions. So folks who are listening, if there are things you want us to discuss, questions that you have, I am seeing quite a few comments about bail and bail reform, and I think we should touch on that in a minute. But go ahead and put those questions in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll get to them in a minute. But in the meantime, where should folks go to find out more? How can folks get involved? What do you want everybody to do when they get off the webinar tonight?
You can Google the Montana Racial Equity Project and go to our website. If you want to learn more about what we've got going on, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, on Instagram. Right now, we're featuring Black authors throughout February for Black History Month. And we have a book club with a lot of books that focus on criminal justice. There you go.
I'll just say too, we are at the Innocence Project here in Montana is at mtinnocenceproject.org. But I want to say too, like, one of the best things about, you know, Innocence work is amazing. I'm obviously a little biased, but one of the most amazing things about it is the intersection between, I get to work with these wonderful people here who are doing really very different work, but very much the same. And so I would just say that taking a look at not only take a look at the organizations that are in your local community that show up in the public safety space, that show up in the abolition space. And you know, one of the ways that you can really get a whole lot of information, and I encourage it every chance I get, is to pay attention to the committees that are active during the interim session of your legislature, because you get to really learn a lot of the sort of what happens behind the scenes, and start to get to know the players that you should really be paying attention to for good reasons and not so good reasons. And then absolutely vote. Like, I can't stress enough, become involved in any way that you can to make sure that your voice is being heard in that way. So.
Thank you, Amy, for bringing up getting involved in the legislature, even when it's not in session, when the interim is going on. And, oh, thank you, Danny, for putting that in the chat. I'm not affiliated with any organization right now. You can follow me on my public account on Instagram, where I try to share resources and also ask questions. Like, what do you all think about this? Or I really want to hear what are the hesitations to defunding the police and abolition work, and break down some of those, both in myself and in the community. And I just want to highlight that again, that I'm learning all of this and I'm going to make mistakes. And the people who are leading the abolitionist movement are Black women, women of color, and trans and non-binary folks. And they're fucking amazing. Here are some, but not all, of the people who inspire me and teach me. And I'll put it in the chat after I say them. It's Derica Purnell, Patrice Cullors, Miriam Kaba, Adrienne Marie Brown, Angela Davis, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Kianga Yamada Taylor, Charlene Carruthers, Mia Mingus, Victoria Law, David Spade, Nikita Oliver. And I want to just highlight Nikita Oliver. They taught an Abolition 101 course at Seattle University Law School, and then made the but I just forgot the name of the course materials available online. So you can look and you can follow along, and it's community friendly. So they really tried to make it so you didn't have to buy anything. So online resources, or I highly recommend getting stuff at your local library. And then another person, and I think that, you know, in this talk around healing, we do really, and I think that Courtney brought this up, we need to talk about accountability, because we can't just move away from a criminal justice system without having compassionate accountability. And I really don't think we have that right now in our communities. I wonder how many of us really even have that in our relationships. So there's one individual who I absolutely adore. His name is Daria, and he has an online resource called Accountability Mapping. And if you haven't really thought about ways that you can be accountable in your life, in your community, in your relationships, that's where it really starts before we go too far externally, and how we can be accountable past that.
Well, thank you, all of you. I feel like we have our work cut out for us in a number of ways in the weeks ahead. I want to flag a couple of things. Danny dropped the link to the Law and Justice Interim Committee. That's a legislative committee that meets in between legislative sessions that Amy referred to There's also some really interesting work going on in the Children and Families Health and Human Services Interim Committee, specifically talking about mental health care and substance use disorder treatment, which are woefully underfunded and underinvested in the state. And, you know, it's a bummer to me to see those conversations happening separately because I think they are deeply interconnected, but nonetheless, there is some good work going on. I want to pull up a couple of questions that we have from attendees. So the first question is talking about Missoula's crisis response team. And Zuri, I think you alluded to some like current challenges, and the question is, can you say a little bit more about it? Have those problems been addressed?
No, they haven't. I say that just because I'm so frustrated with it. When organizers were advocating for the crisis or supporting the crisis response team, it was coming in through grant funding. And so it wasn't going to be permanent. It was just a 10-month grant and it wasn't 24 hours. And, you know, they were saying like, we need to see the data first from these 10 months to see if this is even going to work for our community. And, you know, we were talking about like the meet the need of the community. This isn't a 9 to 5. I think that one of the biggest challenges that organizers faced in getting this implemented in the way that was going to be best for the community was keeping it separate from police response. And that included when someone sees someone possibly in crisis, they can call a number that isn't 911, that isn't dispatch. And unfortunately, that is not what happened. The money was tied to the fire department. It went through 911. The dispatcher got to decide whether it was a crisis response or not. Oftentimes, if anything that was perceived as a weapon was seen, then automatically they would have police response, which is really just unfair to the person who's potentially in crisis. Of course, there's lots of racial undertones to what constitutes a weapon, and also classist undertones to what constitutes a weapon, or who's a dangerous person. And one of the most discouraging things is recently they've talked about actually housing the crisis response team in the police department. So while it was supposed to be kept separate, now they're going to integrate it. And it will be, I think, both an officer and a crisis response person will respond to the incident, which just makes things very challenging for a crisis response team to do their job and the person to feel supported in that. But it's not over yet. There's people in Missoula will get fired up about this.
Well, on that note, there was a question from one of our participants about all of y'all's thoughts on community policing. The question was broad, so if you have thoughts on community policing. Okay, we'll let that one percolate for a minute. And when your thoughts on community policing do come up, we'll come back around to it. A question here is, how do folks feel about juvenile justice reform in Montana at present? With the Youth Court Act not technically criminal, but the spirit of the act not being applied, it seems like the youth courts are overly punitive and implemented closer to our adult system. So I'll admit, this is an area, youth courts and juvenile justice, that I don't know very much about. Does anyone want to take a stab at that?
I don't know that I fully understood the question, but I do know that the Center for Restorative Youth Justice in Kalispell does really amazing work and has a great diversion program for youth in the community who can kind of circumvent the criminal legal system and not face as many repercussions because of that. So I would just uplift that organization and the amazing work they're doing in Kalispell to help youth avoid the system.
Great. And then one more question. Someone brought up Brendan Galbraith's case from here in Missoula, and I know, Zuri, you were really involved in that case. And it's a pretty devastating situation that folks have been deeply involved in over the last year. Do you want to give a quick update for folks asking specifically about that?
Yeah, I will say that this is a really devastating case, and it's also a case that really highlights that even with dash cam footage or body cameras on police, we still don't have answers, and there is a lack of transparency from the Missoula Police Department around what actually happened. And you can see both from the press release, the initial press release from the police department and the initial press from the local papers, that there was a lot of assumptions made around criminality and assumptions made based on racial identity of Brendan. It's possible that there was a crisis happening, and this just goes back to the fact that police shouldn't be responding to someone in crisis. I don't know if that's for sure. It is a question that the family has, and right now, if you want to support the family in getting answers to this, I highly encourage you to share information about this case. I think the Montana Women Vote shared information when it happened. And if you have resources donating to the family, because they do have a legal battle ahead of them to get any answers. The only thing that they've gotten from the police from the last time I checked in was a screenshot of whatever footage was taken during that incident, but it is not clear answers around what actually happened, and truly devastating. And this is another instance where I think it's so important to separate the coroner's office from the sheriff's department, because in this instance, it was the sheriff's department looking into Brendan's death and determining cause of death. And this is a altercation with police, and I just don't think that that's appropriate, and justice is not going to happen in that case, in my opinion. And even though it went to further analysis with the Montana Department of Justice, I still think that there is the type of relationships where I don't know if that family will get answers without legal support.
So thank you for that. I will just note there's been an incredible ongoing list of resources, websites, legislative resources, authors and books, and Montana Women Vote staff will pull all of this from the chat, and we will put it into a little document and put it up on our website. So if you didn't capture everything, don't worry, you can go to our website. Might take us until early next week, but we'll get it up there and you can pull that down and continue the conversations and the learning that I think feel so important to all of us. So I do want to give each of our panelists just a minute for any last thoughts, things that came to you during the discussion or closing words, and then we will close out tonight. Amy, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. So I know there was a question about community policing, and then we all just fell silent. And so I just want, this is my personal opinion or my personal views on community policing. If we're talking about community policing in the way that I'm familiar with it, like the deployment of officers to a particular community to become one with the community or start familiarizing themselves, I would say we need less community policing. That I think that community policing, while maybe it has some noble sentiment or roots, it rarely turns out that way. It usually ends up being just over policing, particularly of communities of color, and over policing of communities of color ends up with the mass incarceration of predominantly Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So like I said, it's just my take on community policing. I also, how there was something about the juvenile justice system, and Courtney had talked about restorative justice aspects. And I know that earlier in our conversation, Zuri had also talked a little bit about restorative justice and different aspects of restorative justice. One of the things that I would say from a policy perspective, and if you are focusing on helping to advocate and organize in those kinds of things, is that law enforcement can lie to anybody when they're interrogating them. But in the state of Illinois, they can no longer lie to youth when they are interrogating. And so I would just encourage you to take a look, if you haven't yet, at that particular legislation and how it came to be. It's really sort of interesting, and to me personally inspiring, that there is hope that we might be able to eliminate that kind of deception, at least for young people. And then also taking a look at, life sentences for juvenile offenders. That is something that I hope to see abolished, and I hope to see it abolished in my lifetime. But it's something that the Montana Innocence Project will be taking a look at, particularly as we are expanding the scope of our work into unjust convictions, beyond innocence, but taking a look at effective life sentences for juvenile offenders. And then closing, just thanks so much for inviting me. And again, I'm just so incredibly inspired by the work of Courtney and Zuri and of you, Howell, and thanks to everybody who gave their time tonight to participate.
Thanks to you, Amy. Courtney, any loose threads you want to tie up, or closing thoughts?
Yeah, I was going to go back to the community policing question. I agree with a lot of the sentiment that Amy expressed, and would also add that a lot of times we try to, I guess, put police in communities without looking at the historical context of what's happened in the past, and just kind of sweep everything under the rug that's happened with communities of color, and just pretend that we can start over and everything can be happy and cheerful relationship, without actually addressing, hey, these horrible things happened in the past. We can't just pretend and like we're in a vacuum and that police officers are coming into our communities to help when in fact they've hurt in a lot of ways in the past. So if anyone does work with police agencies on community policing, I hope you seriously take that into consideration before just implementing some type of community policing program. And so what else? What was it? Lastly, I don't really have anything else to say to wrap up. I'm really glad that I could be a part of this panel, and I appreciate you inviting me. This is the first panel in Montana that I've been with only BIPOC individuals, so that's pretty cool.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Courtney, and I hope personally to see you on many panels in the near future. You have a lot of incredible insight to share. Zuri, I'll kick it over to you for any last thoughts.
I will first say thank you to both Courtney and Amy. It's humbling to sit next to both of you all on this panel, and I just already learned so much from both of you and working in spaces with you, and I really appreciated getting to have this chat. I will just really encourage everyone who is either here now or listening to this later to get involved in criminal justice reform and really think about what public safety means both to you and to your community. There are so many ways to get involved. There's voting, there's learning about it, there's engaging in conversations with your family and your community, and really approaching the things that we've been taught to believe with curiosity. Like, why do we need jails? Why do we need the vicinity police? I hope you all appreciate the up voice that I make with why do we need this? Because I think if we can approach it with curiosity in ourselves and really get to the root of, does this make me feel safe? What would make me feel safe? I think we really get to ways to build public safety, and we will need to do it together. I think that it will take work, and I am also hopeful that in my lifetime, we'll start to see a lot of that come to fruition. And everyone who's here, I want to see you all give testimony or share your story. There's so many things that were happening in the chat, and I immediately wanted to be like, hey, let's chat. I want to hear more about this. I want to hear more about your experience because so many people are impacted by the criminal justice system, and it is stigmatized and people don't want to talk about it. So we need more people talking about it.
Well, thank you, Zuri and Amy and Courtney. Really appreciate so much your time and your expertise and your willingness to share. I will take a moment of facilitator's privilege here to say that, one of the things that I am reminded every time we have these conversations is that crime is a political construct. I think, Amy, you said that earlier. It is something that lawmakers decide on, things that were legal, that are legal now were illegal 10 years ago, vice versa. These are things that we can change, and certainly our response to crime is absolutely within our control. And so even though I think sometimes it feels like we are fighting against big social and cultural behemoth, there are avenues for change. There is change being made. There are these wonderful people doing this amazing work every day in the state. And so I think it's important for us to look for the cracks and continue to push and fight back where we can, as well as holding on to the bigger picture and the vision for abolition in the future, or whatever your vision in the future might be. We are going to drop that evaluation link into the chat, and I do ask for 2 minutes of your time to share your thoughts. We love to hear them. And if you want to add your name at the bottom, you will be entered into that raffle. You don't have to, it's optional, but we are giving away some good stuff. We are recording this and we'll put this recording up on our website. And like I said, we'll try and collate those links and resources, that's the word, those resources from the chat, and get them onto our website as well. We encourage you to stay in touch. We have a criminal legal reform channel in our conference Slack, so folks can continue this conversation there. You can get in touch directly with any of our Montana Women Vote staff, and I'm pretty sure that our panelists would welcome your continued engagement and conversation as well. And if there were unanswered questions, I know there were some stuff that we didn't cover. We could probably have a whole session on bail and the many problems with bail and how we need to get rid of bail, and what that could look like. And I'm sorry we didn't get to dive deeper into that. But if you do have questions, you can email me directly at howell@montanawomenvote.org, and I would love to continue that conversation. So that is all, and I will say thanks once more to our panelists, and we have 2 more sessions of WPLI left. Tomorrow at noon, healthcare policy in 2022, and Wednesday at 5:30, Indigenous justice and state tribal policy, both excellent conversations. So join us there if you'd like. And thank you all. Good night.
Thanks, everyone.